Hand over your ID right now." The screeching voice of Karen Blackwood shattered the calm of the afternoon like a siren in a library, sharp and jarring. There she stood, all 5 feet 2 inches of indignation, her face flushed an angry shade of crimson, as if she'd been left simmering under the sun too long, her finger jabbing toward my wife Victoria, who had just stepped out of our black Tesla Model S, with the effortless poise of someone far too composed to ever be shaken by drama. Karen, practically trembling with self-righteous fury, clutched a thick HOA binder to her chest like it was a sacred relic, her voice echoing down the pristine streets of Maple Ridge as though she were delivering a sermon to the masses. From my seat in the car, I could see curtains twitching, sprinklers conveniently turning on, and curious neighbors finding sudden interest in their mailboxes, all drawn by the escalating theater unfolding before them. And yet, in the eye of this chaotic storm, Victoria remained the picture of grace, calm, composed, her soft smile betraying not even the faintest trace of annoyance. She stood there, one hand resting lightly on the open car door, her designer handbag swinging lazily by her side, exuding the kind of elegance that made the entire confrontation feel almost cinematic. Meanwhile, Karen, the self-crowned monarch of our high-end enclave, seemed hell-bent on proving my wife was some kind of security threat. "You think you can just stroll into our neighborhood without showing ID?" she barked, her voice now climbing into glass-shattering territory. "I don't care how sleek your car is or how expensive your outfit looks. Nobody enters Maple Ridge without clearance from me." With that, she flailed her regulation-stuffed binder like a knight might brandish a sword, completely unaware of how absurd she appeared, or how many neighbors were now openly gaping at her from behind hedges and half-closed windows. What truly caught my attention, though, was the strange way Karen kept glancing. Nervous glances toward the upstairs window of her own home, all the more suspicious, like she was performing under pressure, her trembling hands betraying the possibility that this entire confrontation was being orchestrated by someone else watching. From above, Victoria, unbothered as ever, responded in a voice so calm it sent a chill down my spine. "I don't think that will be necessary," she said, her tone smooth and measured, the kind of voice sharpened over years of handling boardrooms, legal negotiations, and difficult personalities with surgical precision. It carried just the right weight to make any sane person pause, but Karen Blackwood, of course, was not most people. Not necessary? She screamed, now so red-faced she looked like she might combust. "Lady, I am the chairman of the Homeowners Association, and I have every right to verify your presence. This is a private community with strict security protocols, and suspicious vehicles can't just park wherever they please." The absurdity of her claim hung in the air like smog, the suspicious vehicle in question being a brand new Tesla, parked directly in front of the very home we had just purchased, the keys to which were literally dangling from Victoria's left hand. But reason had clearly left the building. More concerning, however, was the crack in Karen's voice when she said security protocols, a tiny fracture of fear that hadn't been there before, and the way she kept nervously tapping her phone screen as though waiting for a message, or maybe even a signal. I was on the verge of stepping out to put an end to this farce myself when Victoria did something unexpected. With a sigh of patient elegance, she reached into her designer handbag, the same polished leather one she'd carried faithfully since our early days together, and pulled out her wallet. I assumed she'd finally decided to end the drama with a driver's license or a homeowner's deed. But when she opened it, she didn't reach for her ID. Instead, she revealed something that made Karen's walked into the room, and now, in hindsight, seemed far less innocent than I had originally assumed. Karen's entire demeanor shifted. In a heartbeat, when Victoria flashed that sleek black card, unlike anything I'd ever seen before, with an unfamiliar silver emblem that looked vaguely governmental, maybe even military. Her expression collapsed from righteous fury to sheer panic, her face draining of color so quickly it was like watching a balloon deflate. "No," she whispered, barely audible, her voice trembling as the thick binder of regulations slipped from her fingers and landed on the pavement with a dull, forgotten thud. "That can't be real. You can't possibly be." But she couldn't even finish the sentence, her eyes locked on the card as if it might explode. From my seat in the car, I leaned forward, straining to get a better look, suddenly consumed by curiosity. What exactly had Victoria just shown her? What level of authority could silence a woman like Karen Blackwood in seconds? But even more fascinating than Karen's collapse was Victoria's composed performance. She hadn't just won a petty neighborhood squabble, she'd orchestrated a masterclass in quiet dominance. It became clear this wasn't some spontaneous confrontation, but something far more deliberate. The timing was too perfect. The way Victoria waited until Karen had reached a fever pitch before revealing her trump card. The way she didn't say a word afterward, simply holding Karen in a calm, commanding silence. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about ID or parking spots. This was a message, a calculated move played with precision. And the more I thought about it, the more suspicious the puzzle pieces became. Her insistence that we park directly in front of Karen's house rather than in our own driveway to get a feel for the area. Those vague phone calls she'd been making for weeks, calls that always ended when I walked in, her clipped tone switching to cheerful small talk. In a heartbeat. Now, watching Karen slowly back away with her hands slightly raised like a guilty party caught mid-crime, I couldn't shake the growing suspicion that whatever my wife had just revealed, it wasn't just meant for Karen to see. Entered the room, and now this mysterious black card had the power to reduce Maple Ridge's most infamous busybody into a trembling, incoherent wreck. Karen remained fixated on it, as though staring at a live grenade, when her phone rang a piercing digital chime that sliced through the tension and made her flinch like she'd been zapped. Her hands, visibly trembling, fumbled with the device, and one glance at the caller ID seemed to drain the last bit of color from her already ghostly face. I can't answer that right now," she whispered, her eyes darting between the ringing phone and Victoria's composed, almost regal demeanor. "Yes, you can," Victoria replied, her voice still gentle, but with a quiet authority that sent a shiver down my spine, an edge I'd never heard from her before. "I think you should." Karen stood frozen, the phone still ringing in her hand, paralyzed by the impossible choice between answering a call she clearly dreaded and dealing with the consequences of ignoring it in front of Victoria, who had, in the span of minutes, flipped the entire power dynamic upside down. By now, half the neighborhood had abandoned their half-hearted gardening charades and were openly watching the scene unfold, some with phones discreetly filming what had quickly become the most captivating spectacle Maple Ridge had witnessed. in years. I could almost see the gears grinding in Karen's mind as she struggled to comprehend how she'd gone from confidently policing the community to nervously facing off against a woman she'd grossly underestimated. Sitting there in the passenger seat, I began to realize this wasn't just an embarrassing H.O.A. clash, this was a calculated reveal. The card, the timing of the phone call, the public setting, and my wife's unfazed elegance all pointed to something far more deliberate. It was now undeniable that Victoria had not only anticipated this confrontation, but had choreographed her response with chilling precision. And that raised a much bigger question. If she knew all along about Karen's aggressive gatekeeping, about her habit of publicly shaming newcomers, then why hadn't she? Just a peaceful enclave of wealthy suburbanites, it was the epicenter of something far more controlled, secretive, and sinister than I ever could have imagined. And the more I read, the deeper the rabbit hole went. But before that night unraveled into a blur of late-night coffee and glowing screens, I kept returning to the same nagging question: why hadn't Victoria warned me? And more hauntingly, what was on that black card that could turn a woman like Karen, known for her iron-fisted H.O.A. reign and nuclear-level temper, into a stammering, broken shell of herself? A part of me began to suspect that the woman sleeping soundly beside me wasn't as gentle and unassuming as she appeared. Maybe she'd never been. Our move to Maple Ridge, once pitched as the start of a peaceful, picture-perfect life, was beginning to feel more like an entry point into something calculated and deeply layered. Back on that street, the phone had still been ringing, Karen still paralyzed with indecision, and Victoria still smiling, that enigmatic, quietly amused smile that now chilled me more than comforted me. That night, as she slept peacefully under the soft wash of moonlight, I lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with suspicion. I couldn't shake the image of Karen's pale, terrified face or the eerie calm in Victoria's eyes when the call came in, like she'd been expecting that exact moment all along. Something was off. I'd seen enough subtle cues in my life to know when a situation had hidden rules, and this one screamed of unseen players and unspoken stakes. And so, instead of waiting for answers to come to me, I got up, padded silently to the spare bedroom we'd rushed into a makeshift office, and opened my laptop. What began as innocent curiosity spiraled into a research session that would shatter every illusion I had about our new home. The county records revealed a history that had been meticulously buried. Maple Ridge wasn't just exclusive, it was protected, insulated, with a trail of classified contracts, shadowy real estate transactions, and residents who had backgrounds that didn't quite align with their cover stories. My blood ran cold as I scrolled through document after document. This neighborhood, with its pristine sidewalks and luxury sedans, wasn't what it seemed. And if Victoria had known all of this, if she had planned our move here with full awareness of what lay beneath the surface, then the real mystery wasn't about Karen, or the black card, or even the H.O.A. It was about my wife, and who she really was. With you. That last sentence hit harder than I expected, not because it was shocking, I'd already begun to suspect as much, but because of how calmly she said it, like someone finally setting down a heavy bag they'd been carrying for far too long. My screen still glowed with highlighted legal clauses, ownership trails, and damning timelines, all pointing to the same unshakable truth. Every home in Maple Ridge, including ours, wasn't truly owned by its residents. The land beneath our feet belonged to a shadowy entity called Sterling Holdings, a corporate behemoth that controlled massive swaths of property across the tri-state area, yet managed to stay almost entirely out of public view. Each house sat atop a lease, not a deed, and buried within those labyrinthine agreements was a clause granting Sterling Holdings the unilateral power to revoke any lease at any time with a mere 30 days' notice, no reason required. In essence, every resident here was a tenant dressed in the illusion of ownership, and the vast majority likely had no idea. But someone did, and that someone had been using the threat of eviction like a puppet string, pulling it tight around the throats of anyone who dared step out of line, including Karen Blackwood. Now, the sight of her collapsing in the face of Victoria's black card made perfect, terrifying sense. That card wasn't just a symbol, it was leverage, the kind that could upend lives overnight. Around 3 a.m., as I scrolled through HOA minutes that were suspiciously vague, yet strangely synchronized with lease enforcement activity, I heard the quiet creak of floorboards behind me. "Can't sleep either?" Victoria's voice floated into the room, soft but carrying a weight I hadn't noticed before, like she was finally ready to stop pretending. She stepped into the warm glow of the desk lamp, wearing the silk robe I'd gifted her last anniversary, her hair loose, her expression unreadable, a perfect storm of elegance and enigma. She sat beside me with a smoothness that betrayed familiarity, as if she'd done this before in another life or another city. "I figured you'd want some answers," she said, her eyes scanning the mess of open tabs and highlighted files on my screen. And then came the confession that confirmed everything I'd been suspecting since the moment Karen's phone rang on the sidewalk. "The truth is, Marcus, I haven't been entirely honest." For choosing Maple Ridge, every little decision that had seemed quirky or oddly specific now snapped into place like puzzle pieces, finally forming a recognizable image. "I haven't been entirely honest with you about why we moved here or about what I used to do before we met," Victoria said, and though I'd suspected it for hours, hearing it aloud landed like a gut punch. Not out of anger, but because it confirmed what I'd feared since watching Karen unravel at the sight of that card. My wife had always been composed in ways that felt almost unnatural, able to diffuse chaos with a word, make impossible phone calls produce results, and access information that no ordinary person should be able to. "I wasn't just consulting for government agencies," she continued, her voice low, steady, eyes locked on mine. "I worked for the CIA for 15 years, Marcus. And I wasn't just part of it. I was good. Very good. But over time, the lies ... wore me down. Every relationship I had disintegrated under the weight of secrets. So when I met you, I tried to leave that life behind. I thought maybe I could be normal. Have a real marriage. A real home." She reached across and gently closed my laptop, her other hand sliding into mine with a softness that belied the enormity of what she was telling me. But apparently, normal isn't in the cards for people like me. Then she explained what had brought us here, how 6 months ago, her former contacts reached out, not for a reunion, but because they'd uncovered something alarming. Across the country, suburban communities like Maple Ridge were being used as front-safe-looking shells for operations involving money laundering. Real estate shell games and organized crime, all carefully obscured by the bureaucracy and conflict of HOA drama. Maple Ridge wasn't a random pick, she said, her voice now edged with the cold sharpness of a trained operative resurfacing. We moved here because someone is hiding something big behind these manicured lawns and block party smiles. I'm here to find out who and what. The air between us was heavy with the gravity of her words, the quiet hum of the house suddenly feeling too loud, too ordinary for a moment this profound. As I sat there, her fingers still wrapped around mine, I replayed every conversation we'd had about the move, every house we'd visited, every odd little moment that didn't quite make sense, and realized I hadn't just married a brilliant woman. I'd married a spy, and whatever peaceful life I thought we were building was about to get a lot more dangerous, to be doing a lot more observing than commuting. He's not from the neighborhood, she said softly, flipping through the photos. No HOA sticker, no deliveries, no routine. Just a car, a man, and a camera pointed at our front door. Her voice was calm, but I could feel the tension beneath it, the carefully measured restraint of someone used to high-stakes games. As I stared at the images, everything we'd experienced since moving here suddenly reframed itself in my mind, not just strange, but calculated. I needed to be sure, she continued. Sure that this wasn't just another corrupt HOA power play. Sure that Karen was connected to something bigger. And I needed you to see it all unfold for yourself so you'd understand just how serious this is. But what struck me even more than the story she was unraveling was the way she looked at me, not with fear or apology, but with a vulnerable hope I hadn't seen in her before, as if she was waiting for me to either run from the truth or rise to meet it with her. And weirdly, something inside me clicked. Like a gear that had been turning silently all along finally locking into place. The real estate consultancy, I said slowly, pieces of our shared history reassembling in my mind under a whole new light. That was your cover, wasn't it? All those business trips, the late-night phone calls, the friends in high places who always seemed to owe you favors. She nodded, the barest movement, but her eyes never left mine. There was a raw honesty in her gaze now, like sharing the truth had taken more courage than all her field missions combined. But if you knew Karen was dangerous, I asked, if you knew what kind of threat we were walking into, why didn't you just tell me from the start? Why let her blindside you like that? Victoria's smile returned, then wry, tired, but real, and it was the first time since we'd stepped foot in this neighborhood that I saw the woman behind the operative, the partner behind the agent. Because I needed to see how deep this goes. I needed Karen to show her hand first, to act without knowing I was watching. And mostly, she added, reaching out to take my hand again, because I was hoping you might want to help me figure out what's really going on here. And just like that, I realized our life in Maple Ridge wasn't falling apart. It was just beginning a very different chapter. Eyebrow as she stepped into the room, still toweling off her hair, her expression a mix of surprise and cautious admiration. You called an HOA meeting? She repeated, her tone laced with curiosity, but also something else, respect. I nodded, not even trying to hide the smirk on my face. If we're going to start pulling threads, we might as well do it where everyone's watching. The night before had changed everything. Seeing those photos of the black sedan, always parked just far enough to seem inconspicuous, but close enough to track our movements, had confirmed what we both already suspected: someone was surveilling us. And judging by Corinne's uncharacteristic meltdown and terrified glance at that black card, we weren't just dealing with a nosy HOA chair. We were up against something structured, something protected. That car belongs to someone who's been watching us, Marcus, Victoria had said, her voice low and certain. And after yesterday, I think we're finally close to finding out who's really running the show in this neighborhood. As I studied those images, a strange surge of adrenaline rushed through me, not fear, but focus. The same electric buzz I got whenever I was deep in the trenches of unraveling deeply encrypted code, solving logic puzzles where lives might be on the line. She was right, I did want in. But before we plunged into this together, I had a secret of my own to share. So while she showered that morning, I picked up my phone and dialed a few numbers I hadn't touched in years, former colleagues from my old days, contracting for 3-letter agencies. People who'd once called me the go-to guy for exposing buried data trails and cracking digital walls. In our world, even after we retire, we never really leave, we just go quiet. And I'd been quiet long enough. As Victoria emerged from the bathroom, ready for war in her towel and unshakable calm, I'd already spun up encrypted backups of Maple Ridge's financial records, cross-referenced vendor payments against known shell companies, and uncovered patterns that screamed of laundering, kickbacks, and possible bribery tied directly to HOA fees and land lease management. "We're not just dealing with petty fraud," I said, turning my laptop toward her. "This thing's bigger than you thought. But lucky for you, I've got a few tricks up my sleeve too." Her expression softened into a grin, half pride, half disbelief. "You called an HOA meeting?" she asked again, now clearly amused. "I figured it was time we returned the favor," I said. "Let them wonder what we're really here for." Victoria arched an eyebrow as she read the email I'd sent to every resident of Maple Ridge, an artfully worded message disguised as a concerned inquiry about property values and community safety, but in reality, a well-placed opening shot in what was about to become a very public unraveling of a meticulously hidden money laundering scheme. "Marcus," she said slowly, still scanning the text, "what exactly did you before you became a freelance software developer?" I had been anticipating this question for years, dreading it with the same weight she must have carried about her own past. But now that it was finally out in the open, I felt oddly relieved, like I could finally be the version of myself I'd kept buried beneath NDAs and half-truths. "Remember when I told you I worked for a tech company that handled government contracts?" I began, and she nodded, eyes locked on mine. "Well, the tech company part was true, but the nature of those contracts ... not so much. I spent 8 years tracking financial crimes through digital networks for the Treasury Department. Money laundering, fraud rings, crypto schemes, you name it, I traced it. Before that, I was the guy they called when certain foreign governments got too close to systems they had no business accessing." Victoria blinked, and her expression shifted from shock to a flicker of amused respect, maybe even pride. I realized then that we'd both been playing the same game, wearing masks in the name of protection, only to end up married to our mirrors. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, the emergency HOA meeting convened in the community center. And watching Karen Blackwood sit at the head of the conference table was like watching a monarch awaiting her public dethroning. Gone was the imperious, rule-wielding tyrant. In her place sat a pale, visibly rattled woman clutching a single manila folder like a life raft one she wasn't sure would float or sink. The other board members, a group that included retired engineers, semi-retired attorneys, and a few ambitious millennials with a fondness for neighborhood politics, filled the rest of the seats with a palpable air of confusion. They'd been summoned to a meeting with no agenda, and it showed in their nervous chatter and darting glances. Most of them had no clue they'd been propping up a front for something far more insidious than petty H.O.A. squabbles. Victoria and I slipped into seats near the back of the room, our movements casual but precise, and I couldn't help but notice how she positioned herself with a clear line of sight to every exit, and old instinct kicking in, like muscle memory, forged in shadows, a habit that likely came from 15 years of living with the reality that any routine meeting could detonate into something far more volatile. Victoria's instinctual positioning near the exits spoke volumes, and as I stood, phone in hand, that same air of high-stakes control settled over the room like a fog. "Before we begin," I said, my voice calm but firm, "I want everyone here to know that this meeting is being recorded for legal purposes, and copies of this recording will be shared with appropriate law enforcement agencies if necessary." The effect was immediate and visceral. Karen's already pale face drained to a near-translucent hue. Two board members leaned toward each other in a panicked whisper, and a man in the front row abruptly stood only to hesitate, glance around, nervously, and awkwardly sit back down. I let the silence hang for just long enough before continuing. "Over the past 24 hours, my wife and I have uncovered significant information regarding the financial structure of this community information that I believe every property owner in Maple Ridge has a right to see." I could feel the room tighten around me, attention sharpening like a laser as I connected my phone to the projector and queued up the first slide. What followed was a forensic breakdown that would have earned a standing ovation from my former Treasury supervisors. Layered flowcharts tracing money as it slipped through a web of shell companies, photographic evidence of the same black sedan surveilling multiple homes, and copies of land lease documents most residents had never seen documents. That made it clear no one truly owned their home. But the moment that truly shifted the room came when I pulled up the bank statements. "These documents," I said, tapping the screen as spreadsheet after spreadsheet lit up with meticulously organized transaction logs, were obtained through entirely legal means. And according to this data, millions of dollars have moved through H.O.A. accounts, money that clearly wasn't spent on landscaping or community amenities. A stunned silence followed, broken only by a low gasp from someone near the front. "Someone," I continued, my voice steady but resolute, "has been using our association as a front for laundering funds from sources I doubt any of you would willingly associate with." Karen was now visibly trembling, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned bone white. And when her phone buzzed on the table with what was clearly a text message, she flinched and let out a barely audible whimper, a sound that felt out of place coming from someone who, just days earlier, had ruled over this neighborhood like a self-declared queen dot, as if his very presence siphoned the last bit of defiance from her body. The message she'd received, just 3 words, "This is now," paired with the initials RB, suddenly made perfect sense. Whoever RB was, he wasn't just an investor or a shadowy figure pulling strings from afar. He was here, in the flesh, and from the moment he stepped into the room, the atmosphere shifted from tense to suffocating. This man radiated authority, like a weaponized aura, the kind that silences rooms and crushes opposition without ever needing to raise his voice. Karen's collapse into herself confirmed what her eyes already had. This was the man she feared, the real power behind Maple Ridge's porcelain facade. The room, filled just moments ago with confused outrage and whispers of betrayal, now fell into stunned silence as he stepped forward, the sound of his polished shoes on tile echoing like a metronome of dread. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, voice smooth as silk and just as cold. "But I believe there's been some confusion about what's happening here today, and I'd like to clarify things before anyone makes decisions they might regret." His eyes swept the room, landing briefly on each face, then finally on finally on me. And when our eyes locked, I felt that familiar flash of recognition, the silent acknowledgement that both of us had seen the darker corners of the world most people prefer to pretend don't exist. I didn't need a dossier to know this man had influence that reached far beyond HOA boards and neighborhood squabbles. This was someone used to pulling levers behind curtains, someone whose threats didn't come with volume but with consequences. I held my ground, but I could feel Victoria tense beside me, her body coiled and alert, her instincts kicking into overdrive. This wasn't just about financial crimes anymore. This was about power, control, and the lengths someone like RB would go to protect both. As Karen shrank further into her seat, eyes cast downward and hands trembling in her lap, it became painfully clear that she hadn't just been a pawn, she'd been a warning. A neighborhood queen reduced to a cautionary tale the moment she failed to manage the narrative. And now, with the real king on the board, the game had just entered a far more dangerous phase, like a child caught red-handed. And the way she recoiled in her chair made it painfully obvious that this was RB Richard Blackwood, the puppeteer behind Karen's obsessive need for control. With a calculated smile that never quite reached his eyes, he strode forward and extended his hand toward me. "Richard Blackwood," he said smoothly, "Karen's husband. And you could say I'm something of a silent partner in managing this lovely little community." The way he dragged out the word silent sent a chill down my spine, and I could practically feel Victoria's entire posture shift as her training kicked in, her mind already calculating a dozen contingencies. Richard moved through the room like a king inspecting his court, and from the expressions of the HOA board members, half curious, half terrified, it was clear they viewed him as exactly that. "I understand you've been digging into our financial structure here in Maple Ridge, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice velvety with condescension. "And while I respect a concerned resident's initiative, I fear you may have misunderstood some of the more nuanced elements of those documents." He spoke with the arrogant ease of someone who'd spent his life bending rules and people to his will. And I could see the other attendees watching us like rubberneckers at a highway wreck, fascinated, confused, and utterly unaware of the danger coiling just beneath the surface. But men like Richard often make one critical mistake. They assume that intelligence only lives in boardrooms and that threats must come dressed in designer suits. "Mr. Blackwood," I said evenly, pulling out my phone and tapping the screen to open the voice recording app. "I believe my interpretation is very clear, and something tells me Certain law enforcement agencies would find these patterns even more enlightening than I have. For just a split second, the mask cracked. His practiced smirk twitched ever so slightly, just enough to let me know I'd hit a nerve. And in that instant, I knew this wasn't just a game of money and control anymore. It was war. And when Richard's sharp gaze cut toward Karen, an unmistakable blend of fury and a silent, chilling threat, I understood in a flash that she wasn't the villain here. She was collateral damage, a woman caught in the crosshairs of a man who used fear as currency and power as a leash. Karen had never truly been in control. She'd been playing the role of enforcer not by choice, but out of necessity, trying to shield herself and perhaps others from Richard's ruthless authority. Richard's voice, once polished and persuasive, hardened into something colder, more clinical, as he dropped the charm and opted for raw intimidation. "What you fail to grasp," he said, his tone laced with disdain, "is that communities like Maple Ridge require tight oversight. These financial structures you've uncovered, they're legitimate mechanisms, legal frameworks that protect our residents' investments and keep this neighborhood pristine." But I'd seen this script before, the hollow justifications of men laundering millions while claiming to preserve order and prosperity. I'd studied it, dismantled it, and helped put its authors behind bars. "What I understand," I said, rising from my seat and leveling my gaze at him across the polished table, "is that you've turned this HOA into a shell company, a facade to funnel illicit money. You've silenced dissent, threatened your neighbors, and forced your wife into a role she never asked for, all while hiding in the shadows, pretending to be a concerned citizen." The words landed like a gauntlet thrown at his feet, and for the first time, the smooth mask of Richard Blackwood began to crack, revealing the predator lurking just beneath. The room was silent, thick with tension, until a voice quiet and trembling broke through. "He made me do it," Karen whispered, her eyes glued to the surface of the table, her voice the sound of a soul finally too exhausted to carry its secrets any longer. And in that moment, her confession echoed louder than any accusation I could have made. A very long time. While Richard was busy posturing and trying to regain control of the room, his own phone had been betraying him, feeding you as an unfiltered stream of incriminating data that painted a damning picture of shell companies, offshore accounts, encrypted messages with known criminal entities, and internal communications that tied him directly to the financial manipulation of not just Maple Ridge, but several other planned communities that were nothing more than fronts for large-scale money laundering. Karen's voice had cracked open the door, but the data I now held in my hand was kicking it off its hinges. I tapped my phone and cast a live feed of the collected evidence to the projector screen at the front of the room. The screen lit up with transaction records, message logs, and heat maps showing device locations synced with suspicious activities around HOA meeting times. A few gasps rippled through the room as residents saw proof, real, undeniable proof that they'd all been pawns in something far larger than petty HOA disputes. Richard's face drained of color, and for the first time, his mouth opened with no words to follow. He knew. He understood the implications. I didn't have to say a word. The evidence was speaking louder than any argument could. "Everything has been backed up," I said calmly, "and mirrored to a secure cloud server, monitored by a handful of people who know exactly what to do if anything happens to me or my wife." The message was crystal clear. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was checkmate. Richard Blackwood had underestimated the very people he tried to manipulate. And now, with an entire community watching, with secrets laid bare, and with law enforcement already alerted and inbound, he was no longer the one in control. Securely archived, time-stamped, and cross-referenced in a digital dossier that no amount of legal maneuvering or intimidation could erase. "You see, Richard," I said, my voice steady and measured, "the moment you connected to this building's Wi-Fi, you handed me everything. Your secrets, your schemes, your entire operation, all served up like a confession written in code." The screen shifted to another slide showing IP logs, MAC addresses, transaction timestamps, and message metadata, all converging into a single, undeniable narrative. Richard Blackwood wasn't just a crooked HOA figurehead, he was a high-ranking operative in an international laundering ring that had been hiding in plain sight behind fake neighborhood improvements and community events. His silence told me everything I needed to know. He'd stopped calculating his next move and had started anticipating the consequences. The room was still as the full weight of the revelations sank in. Residents who had once seen Richard as a distant, powerful benefactor now looked at him with a mix of betrayal and disgust. Even Karen, still visibly shaken, straightened in her seat as though years of manipulation were finally lifting from her shoulders. "Law enforcement is already en route," I continued, "and they're bringing federal charges, wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, obstruction, and probably a few surprises they've been saving for this exact moment." I looked around the room, locking eyes with the neighbors we'd come to know. The people who thought they were part of a quiet suburban dream, now awakening to a truth far stranger and darker than they could have imagined. "Maple Ridge will be free of this corruption starting today," I said firmly. "And if anyone else here has been threatened, coerced, or forced into silence, now is your moment to speak." I stepped back and closed the laptop with a quiet finality as sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. The sound of Justice closing in, sitting casually on his phone, unaware that every word he uttered was being logged through his communications and meticulously tracked via his financial transactions. Richard remained oblivious to the trap closing in around him. Victoria, who had been silently observing the scene unfold from the back of the room with the composed focus that comes from over 15 years of dismantling arrogant criminals, finally decided to speak. "What my husband hasn't told you, Richard," she said evenly, "is that this entire conversation has been live-streamed to a secure FBI server, monitored by the Financial Crimes Division, and agents are already en route with warrants for your arrest on charges including money laundering, racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violations of federal banking laws." The sheer panic that flashed across Richard's face was almost ridiculous, like something out of a cartoon where a character suddenly realizes they've run off the edge of a cliff and are about to fall. "You see," Victoria continued smoothly, stepping forward with the calm confidence of someone who had orchestrated scenes like this dozens of times before, "My husband may have left government work behind, but I never truly retired. And when the Bureau flagged suspicious financial patterns in this neighborhood, they asked me to investigate under the cover of an ordinary suburban housewife seeking peace and quiet." The impact of her revelation landed like a shockwave in the room, even hitting me with unexpected force after all. I hadn't known she was still active either. Karen was visibly stunned, her earlier attempts at intimidation now laughable in the face of Victoria's true identity as a federal agent who had spent months building this operation. Richard, on the other hand, looked desperate and cornered, glancing frantically around the room for an escape route, clearly calculating the odds of making a run for it before law enforcement arrived. But what he hadn't accounted for, and what I had been keeping as the final nail in his metaphorical coffin, was that the moment he entered the room, I'd already remotely disabled all the electronic locks on the building's exits, ensuring there would be no escape. A little insurance policy. That's all it was, just a quiet, calculated safeguard to ensure our conversation reached its intended conclusion without any last-minute theatrics or desperate bids for escape. Outside, the sound of sirens grew louder by the second, creeping into the edges of the room like a storm on the horizon, while Richard's breathing grew shallow and erratic as the crushing reality of his downfall finally took hold. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice trembling with a toxic mix of rage and panic that might have been intimidating if I hadn't already stripped him of every last ounce of control he believed he had. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, or what kind of people will come for you once they realize what you've done." But Victoria merely offered that same enigmatic smile she'd worn when Karen demanded her ID the day before, a smile that now made perfect sense. In that moment, I understood that my wife had been maneuvering through a multi-layered game far more intricate than anything Richard Blackwood could have even begun to comprehend. And then, the FBI didn't simply show up, they stormed Maple Ridge with precision and force, a tactical wave of authority that turned the sleepy suburban neighborhood into the centerpiece of a federal sting. It would have been awe-inspiring to witness had I not been right in the middle of it, quietly wondering if Victoria and I had just painted targets on our backs for the kind of criminal syndicates that don't believe in second chances. Leading the charge was Agent Sarah Morrison, a seasoned operative Victoria had been collaborating with for over 6 months, moving with the composed authority of someone whose dismantled empires most people only encounter in crime novels. Behind her, a team of forensic accountants, tech specialists, and armed tactical agents fanned out across the room, their movements practiced and synchronized like a unit that had rehearsed this scene 100 times before. Richard, who had been twitching with nervous energy moments earlier, now visibly collapsed inward, shoulders sagging, eyes unfocused as he realized the truth. His bravado meant nothing. His empire was crumbling, and the full weight of federal justice was about to descend on him with the force of a runaway train. But just when it seemed the curtain had fallen, something happened that none of us could have anticipated. The entire room was caught completely off guard, including Agent Morrison and her highly trained team of federal investigators when, instead of surrendering quietly or asking for a lawyer like most white-collar criminals do when cornered, Richard whipped out his phone and launched into a live social media broadcast with the frantic energy of a man teetering on the edge of ruin, desperate to claw back control by any means necessary. Speaking into the camera with the dramatic flair of a televangelist or a populist politician on the campaign trail, he began spinning an elaborate narrative. "What you're witnessing here today," he declared, voice rising with righteous indignation, Is the federal government persecuting innocent American citizens, people like me, who've done nothing but work to protect our communities, our families, and our property values from unwarranted interference? I watched, half stunned and half intrigued, as he morphed from trapped criminal into self-proclaimed martyr, weaponizing the moment to cast Victoria and me as rogue federal agents, hell-bent on infiltrating and destroying a peaceful neighborhood, under the guise of patriotism and suburban normalcy. His livestream, fueled by manufactured outrage and clever rhetoric, began gaining viewers by the hundreds, then thousands, as comments flooded in from people who didn't understand the truth, but were quick to rally around his anti-government message. "These people," he said, pointing directly at us while never breaking eye contact with his phone camera, "pretend to be just another suburban couple. But they've been spying on you, recording your private conversations, digging into your finances, and building secret files on your lives. All because you dared to challenge their authority." It was propaganda at its most dangerous, an expertly crafted performance that simplified a complex federal case into a dramatic tale of tyranny versus freedom. And I had to admit, grudgingly, that if I hadn't already known the intricate details of Richard's criminal empire, his money laundering schemes and connections to international crime syndicates, I might have been swayed by the story he was telling. But Victoria, unshaken and unamused, wasn't about to let him steal the spotlight or hijack the truth. With the calm, deliberate grace of someone trained to take back control in high-stakes situations, she stepped over to Agent Morrison, leaned in, and whispered something barely audible, yet powerful enough to make the seasoned investigator nod and step aside, granting Victoria full authority to deal with Richard's last-ditch spectacle however she saw fit. "Richard," Victoria said sharply, her voice slicing through his live-streamed monologue with the precision of a scalpel, instantly commanding the attention of everyone in the room, including his rapidly growing online audience. "I think your viewers deserve the whole truth about what's been happening here in Maple Ridge, don't you?" With calm assurance, she held up her own phone, displaying a detailed series of bank records and transaction logs that told a very different story than the one Richard had been weaving. "For example," she continued, her voice cool and unwavering, "they might be interested to know that you've been siphoning money from their HOA dues to fund your little gambling habit. Or that those community improvement projects you've been billing them for, they only exist on fake invoices and phantom contracts. None of the work was ever done." The effect was instantaneous and brutal. Richard's mask of confidence shattered as Victoria began reciting precise dates, transaction IDs, and dollar amounts, exposing a trail of financial misconduct that not only confirmed his ties to international money laundering, but also painted him as a petty thief embezzling directly from his neighbors. The comments section of his live feed, once overflowing with patriotic outrage and blind support, flipped on him like a switch, messages of encouragement giving way to angry accusations and demands for justice from betrayed homeowners watching in real time. "And just in case anyone thought we were done," Victoria added, her voice taking on a courtroom rhythm, the practiced cadence of someone who had done this before, "those monthly security fees you've all been paying? Richard's been pocketing those too. There's no security company, no patrols, nothing but empty promises and fake invoices." The final blow came when Agent Morrison calmly stepped forward holding a tablet, which she turned to face both the room and Richard's still active stream. On the screen was clear surveillance footage from inside, Richard's own home office video that showed him casually counting large stacks of cash while speaking on the phone with individuals clearly not involved in any legitimate real estate deals. "Mr. Blackwood," Agent Morrison said, her tone steady and laced with finality, "this is where your story ends. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right," Agent Morrison said firmly, her voice cutting through the silence with the finality of a gavel strike. "Because everything you say from this point forward is being recorded and will be used against you in court." The live stream was still running, now broadcasting Richard's swift and humiliating downfall to thousands of viewers who, just moments ago, had rallied behind him as a supposed victim of government overreach. As the cold steel of handcuffs locked around his wrists, his phone slipped from his grasp and hit the floor, its camera still recording now, capturing only the view of his shoes and the sterile tiles of the community center as Agent Morrison calmly escorted him toward the door. That's when Corinne, silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice trembled, but there was strength behind it. "I want everyone to know," she said, "that I had no idea about the money laundering or the organized crime ties. I thought the worst thing he was doing was skimming a bit of HOA money for his poker habit." Her words landed with a quiet devastation, a raw and honest admission from someone who'd been emotionally manipulated and threatened into complicity by the one person she should have been able to trust. "He told me," she continued, tears threatening to fall, "that if I didn't keep tight control over the community, if I didn't shut down questions about the finances or the construction projects, we'd lose everything. That the government was always looking for a reason to seize property from people like us, and that our only safety was in silence and control." As the FBI team moved methodically through the room, packing up evidence and securing the scene, I found myself scanning the faces of my neighbors' people who had unknowingly been living within a carefully constructed web of lies, right in the heart of what they believed to be a peaceful, well-managed neighborhood. A criminal operation had taken root among their front lawns and family barbecues, threatening not just their property values, but their safety, their futures, and they never even saw it coming. The tragic irony was almost unbearable. In their desperate efforts to protect Maple Ridge from imagined outside threats, these residents had unknowingly empowered the very danger they feared, placing their trust in a man who saw their loyalty as little more than a tool for personal profit. The very criminal activity these residents were so desperate to guard against had been festering in their own backyard, threatening everything they thought they were protecting. 3 weeks after Richard Blackwood's dramatic arrest and his subsequent federal indictment on charges serious enough to ensure he'd likely spend the rest of his life behind bars, perhaps too old to remember how to tie his own shoes, Corinne showed up on our front porch, holding a casserole dish and wearing a look that blended gratitude with quiet shame. The change in her demeanor was striking. The tense, defensive woman who had once demanded our ID like a neighborhood gatekeeper had vanished, replaced by someone who looked lighter, freer, as though she'd finally been able to set down a burden she'd been carrying alone for far too long. "I know this doesn't make up for what I put you through," she said, her voice no longer wrapped in forced authority, but trembling with sincerity. "But I just wanted to thank you for pulling me out of a situation I didn't even fully understand until I saw that FBI presentation about money laundering and international crime." Victoria, who had been working closely with federal prosecutors to secure Karen immunity in exchange for her testimony, welcomed her inside for coffee, a simple gesture that became the beginning of something bigger. That afternoon turned into the first of many heartfelt conversations that would slowly help rebuild not only Karen's fractured life, but the shattered trust and community spirit in Maple Ridge itself, which had been corroded by years of fear, secrecy, and manipulation. In the wake of Richard's downfall, the legal system moved with stunning speed and precision, as only federal investigations can when bolstered by ironclad evidence and fully cooperative witnesses. Agent Morrison later explained that Richard's case wasn't an isolated incident. It was a critical node in a much larger crackdown on international money laundering rings, where American real estate had been quietly exploited for years as a laundering tool for illicit funds tied to everything from drug cartels and weapons trafficking to human exploitation. What we had uncovered in Maple Ridge was merely the tip of a sprawling criminal iceberg. The digital paper trail I'd traced through Richard's encrypted messages had exposed ties to the infamous Koslov crime family links that triggered a wave of coordinated arrests across 6 U.S. states and 3 foreign nations, ultimately dismantling a sophisticated operation that had managed to thrive unnoticed for nearly a decade. Hiding in plain sight behind white picket fences and manicured lawns in suburban neighborhoods, just like ours, Victoria's pivotal role in the investigation earned her formal commendations from both the FBI and the Treasury Department, along with a generous offer to return to active duty, an offer she graciously declined in favor of pursuing consulting work that would allow her to remain deeply involved in similar cases, but without the constant travel and secrecy that had once made our early relationship a logistical nightmare. But perhaps the most rewarding outcome of the entire ordeal wasn't the awards or the media attention. It was watching Maple Ridge slowly transform from a community gripped by fear, paranoia, and covert manipulation into the peaceful, transparent neighborhood it was always meant to be. When we'd first toured homes here, the glossy brochures promised suburban tranquility, but what we got was a carefully curated illusion masking criminal rot. That illusion had finally been stripped away, and in its place was a community that had reclaimed its identity. The H.O.A. underwent a complete restructuring, with new leadership committed to transparency, including Karen, who stepped into the role of treasurer. Her unique insight into financial misconduct, born from painful personal experience, became the foundation of a new system designed to ensure that nothing like Richard's operation could ever take hold again. The once hostile monthly HOA meetings, previously dominated by rigid control and vague agendas, transformed into collaborative gatherings focused on real issues and resident-driven improvements. No more phantom projects or suspicious line items meant to launder illicit funds. Property values, which had been artificially inflated through Richard's schemes, finally stabilized to reflect the genuine desirability of the neighborhood, no longer manipulated by foreign investors using our streets as storage lockers for dirty money. To our surprise, Victoria and I found ourselves increasingly sought after, not just by Maple Ridge, but by surrounding communities who had followed our story in the national media and wanted to safeguard themselves against similar threats. It turned out our combined backgrounds in cybersecurity and federal law enforcement were uniquely suited to identifying the complex, evolving patterns of criminal infiltration targeting suburban America. So we took the leap and launched Community Security Solutions, a consulting firm dedicated to helping HOAs and property managers detect and prevent the very crimes that had almost torn our neighborhood apart. The work brought with it a sense of fulfillment that neither of us had ever truly found in our previous careers, challenging, purposeful, and deeply rooted in the knowledge that we were now directly protecting families, homes, and communities from criminal elements that viewed quiet suburbs not as sanctuaries, but as soft targets for laundering their corruption. Tranquility, it turned out, had been nothing more than a convenient disguise for the criminal enterprises operating beneath the surface, but now that false peace had been replaced with something real. Karen's evolution from feared neighborhood enforcer to compassionate community advocate became something of a local legend, a powerful story of survival and redemption that she began sharing to help others, especially victims of domestic abuse, recognize the insidious signs of control and manipulation she had lived under for years without fully understanding. With Victoria's help, she began attending therapy, slowly untangling the emotional knots that Richard had tied through financial control, psychological manipulation, and veiled threats designed to isolate her and keep her entirely dependent on his approval. As the months passed, a different Karen emerged, one who was empathetic, engaged, and determined to use her voice and position not to enforce arbitrary rules rooted in fear, but to ensure her neighbors felt seen, heard, and safe. Her work extended beyond Maple Ridge as she partnered with advocacy groups, using her story to shine a light on the ways coercion can hide behind perfectly trimmed hedges and neatly printed HOA bulletins. 6 months after the entire ordeal began, I found myself sitting on our back deck with Victoria, the golden hues of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the neighborhood that had, at last, become the peaceful refuge we dreamed of when we started house hunting. The air was filled with the sound of children playing freely in yards, no longer shadowed by aggressive HOA oversight or the quiet tension of unspoken suspicions. "You know," Victoria said, reaching out to gently take my hand as we sat in that quiet moment. "I think we finally found what we were looking for when we decided to leave the city." And she was right. What we had found wasn't just a house with a backyard and a good school district. It was a true home in the deepest sense. A place rooted in community, where people protected one another, faced challenges together, and refused to let secrecy and fear create space for corruption to thrive. It had taken a federal takedown, an international money laundering scandal, and a complete dismantling of everything we thought we understood about suburban life to get here. But as we sat there, surrounded by the sound of laughter and the scent of freshly cut grass, it was clear that some of the best endings are the ones you have to fight for, and that fight had been worth every second. Have you ever felt powerless in the face of someone who abuses their authority, maybe a toxic HOA president, an overbearing boss, or that one neighbor who thinks the whole street should run on their rules? Marcus and Victoria's story is a powerful reminder that even the most intimidating bullies have skeletons in their closets, and sometimes it's the quiet couple next door who hold the key to exposing the truth. Watching Karen's disbelief turn into Richard's dramatic downfall was the kind of justice that doesn't come easy, but hits with maximum impact when it finally lands. If stories like this speak to something inside you, if you believe in the power of ordinary people rising up to take down those who misuse their power, then you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because every week we bring you real stories of underdogs who don't back down. Another story told, Another win that didn't cost a dime. Thanks for riding the drama train with us, where every twist smells like justice. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment to let us know which power-abusing tyrant you'd love to see exposed next.